And welcome back to Vinyl Friday, the Revolver Odyssey. Now, as many of you know, I have spent the last 7 months of my life on a fairly comprehensive deep dive of one of my favorite albums of all time, Revolver by the Beatles. And during that time, I've been reflecting on what it is about this album that makes it so magical. And so to round up the series, I have put together a list of 10 elements that I believe make a good case for this album being the Beatles' magnum opus. With the caveat that the album that I would call the Beatles' best really just depends on the day. I could probably make the argument that any of their albums was the best if I was in the right mood. But right now, having spent 7 months going through this album track by track, I'm of the opinion that that album is Revolver. So let's go with that. Now, throughout this episode, I'm going to be including clips from that track by track series, but if you would like to watch the entire thing, I'll leave a link to that here. And with that, let's begin the countdown. Number 10. Revolver marks the most dramatic period of evolution in the Beatles' entire career. When you listen to the earlier Beatles albums, you can hear a band that is maturing fairly rapidly. They're clearly a group of musicians who are engaged in the music scene, who are listening to a lot of the work of their peers, absorbing it, and spinning their own interpretation into something truly unique. So for instance, and I'm going with the British releases here, so sorry, Capital. When you listen to With the Beatles, it is recognizably still the band that did Please Please Me. The same's true when you compare Hard Day's Night against With the Beatles, right up until Rubber Soul. Baby, you can drive my car. Compared against Help. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care. You can hear that there is a progression, but up until this album, that progression feels linear. This comes straight out of left field. It is a radically different animal. It's revolutionary in the popular music canon in terms of composition, production, arrangement, recording, artwork. Across all fronts, this album is like nothing else that exists in the contemporary space. I mean, I would make the argument that this album is like nothing that exists now, and anything that does sound remotely like this album is probably derivative. For the longest time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was lauded as the greatest album of all time. And while I will obviously concede that Sgt. Pepper's is an incredible album and historically significant, I would make the case that on Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles did everything that they had already achieved on this album, but with a little bit more expertise and finesse. There's the use of tape loops. There's the orchestral instrumentation. Wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave. You've got lyrical content that goes beyond the romantic. Yeah, the tight smile. There's the Indian music. There is a song for Ringo that the entire group gets together to sing. We all live in a yellow submarine. Help from my friends. There's the graphically distinctive cover design, and so on and so on. Again, the development from Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's feels linear. They're honing skills that they were developing on this album. By contrast, this album is a massive leap forward by comparison against its predecessor, Rubber Soul. He's a real no-one. Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. So in essence, whereas earlier in their career it feels like each new album is a step up from the last, for a range of serendipitous reasons, it feels like this album just rockets into the stratosphere. And while they will continue to innovate throughout the rest of their career, I would contend that that development will never be as dramatic as it is with this album. Number 9. Despite the enormous diversity of songs on this album, it somehow remains cohesive. It sounds like all of those songs do belong on the same album. These tracks span from experimental electronic that sort of seagully sound. It's actually Paul laughing. To Baroque. To Indian Classical. To fully orchestral. To rock and roll. And back again. And yet it does still feel like all of those songs belong on the same album. I think that this is in part due to the Beatles' characteristic vocal tones and their trademark melodic styles. But I also think that some of the songs have these through lines that connect them. The most obvious one is the Indian influence that George brought to this album. Beyond Love You To, which is clearly drawing from the tradition of Indian classical music, the drone that characterizes that style can be found in, for instance, the riff of I Want to Tell You. The outro of She Said, She Said. She said, the verse of Got to Get You Into My Life, where the bass remains on that same note. Hey team, how's it hanging? Obviously, Tomorrow Never Knows, where the entirety of the song remains, arguably, on the one chord.
The Indian music had come into our lives, and the way Indian music just was all on one key. It didn't modulate.
Indian instrumentation can be found on tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows. And the other Beatles nod to this Indian music on other tracks, like Paul's guitar solo on Taxman. Or this little vocal run that he does on the end of I Want to Tell You. I've got time. There are also these shared moments that you find on some of the tracks, and often those tracks are sequenced side by side. For example, And Your Bird Can Sing has this descending motif that you hear in the bass and in the vocals. You tell me that you heard every sound there is. The bass is right there underneath it, highlighting that same descent. And that song is followed by For No One. For No One has verses that are basically defined by this descending bass line. So those two tracks, side by side, employing the same kind of musical ideas. Another example is She Said, followed by Good Day Sunshine. Granted, they are on different sides of the album, but hear me out. She Said ends with this kind of cascading canon of John singing and George singing and John picking it up and George picking it up from there. And the same technique is employed at the end of Good Day Sunshine. She said, I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it's like to be dead. Good day, sunshine, good day, sun, good day, sunshine. Good Day Sunshine and I Want to Tell You both fade in and fade out. These tracks are not adjacent but very close to each other. There are the sort of dual guitar lines that you hear on And Your Bird Can Sing. And on Got to Get You Into My Life. I'm Only Sleeping and Tomorrow Never Knows both have reverse guitar solos. Tomorrow Never Knows and Yellow Submarine both use samples. And so on and so on. So there are these little tidbits that you can pick up as a listener that create this kind of kinship between different songs on the album. It links them together and it makes them feel like they belong in the same place, even if they're totally radically different songs. Another thing that brings all the tracks together is George Harrison's very distinctive guitar tone, which is sort of unique to this album. It's raw, it's kind of aggressive, but there's enough fuzz to it that it's still a little bit warm. That is one of those through lines throughout the album. And I think one of the best things about this album, one of the things that maintains that cohesion, is that every time one of the tracks strays too far from the sort of beaten path of popular music, it'll be followed by something much more familiar, something more rock and roll, something more akin to what they've done in the past, to keep the listener engaged and to remind us, oh, okay, no, it's going to be okay. The Beatles are going to take care of us. We're in good hands. Let's take side one as an example. We open with Taxman, which is kind of like Drive My Car's more abrasive older brother. So, familiar. Then we're hit with Eleanor Rigby,
Fathom,
which is the first track on a Beatles album to not feature any instruments played by the Beatles. There are vocals, and then there is a string quartet. What? We haven't heard this before. But not to worry, they're going to follow it up with I'm Only Sleeping, which, in its kind of acoustic warmth, recalls some of the things that we might have heard on Rubber Soul. Just as we're settling into that, bam, we're hit with Indian music. And again, there was a hint of that on Rubber Soul. But not like this. This entire song is structured around principles, foundations of Indian composition. From the slow start to the fast finish, the song being in one key, the instrumentation, the tabla. These are things that we haven't heard before. This is new. But don't panic. They're following it up with Here, There, and Everywhere, which recalls Michelle, with its beautiful three-part harmony as the bed upon which the lead harmony sits.
Michelle, my belle, making each day of the year.
But they're following that up with a children's song?
We all live in a yellow submarine.
Weird, okay. But the next song is She Said, She Said. Again, nice, comfortable rocker. And so on and so on. So they really take care of us as listeners. They don't just slap us with an album that is entirely novel ideas, entirely unfamiliar, and expect us to digest it as is. They give us these palate cleansers in between those radical courses that are a little bit more in keeping with what we're used to, their standard fare. And that, I think, is what keeps the album together. Number 8, the cover art and title. Here's some covers of other albums that came out in 1966. We've got Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan, Sounds of Silence by Simon & Garfunkel, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears by the Mamas and the Papas, Aftermath by the Rolling Stones, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, Fifth Dimension by the Byrds. Damn, this was a good year for music, incidentally. So, they're a little bit creative, they're doing things a bit different. There are animals, there's color manipulation, some of them are in a bathtub, but they're still photos of bands, right? The cover of Revolver looks like this. It was designed by a man named Klaus Voormann. He was a graphic artist and a bassist, but more than that, he was a character in the Beatles lore who preceded and succeeded the band. Klaus first heard the Beatles in Hamburg in 1960, when Ringo was still playing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and the Beatles were still performing with Stuart Sutcliffe on bass and Pete Best on drums as teenagers. These two groups are what introduced Klaus Voormann to rock and roll. And after the Beatles broke up, Klaus went on to play bass on some of their solo albums. Now, the the Beatles had done interesting things with their album covers in the past, usually with photographer Robert Freeman, who came up with this design for the album. I actually really like Robert Freeman's album cover design, but I prefer Klaus Voormann's, and I'm glad that they went with it, because it not only ties in with the story of the band, it also, I think, accurately depicts the radical change of direction that they are going in. This is not just a photo of the Beatles, this is a collage of photograph and illustration, and they're like popping out of each other's ears, and there's so much hair. Here's Ringo in a 1920s swimsuit, George with a safari hat on, John in a suit of armor, and Klaus himself has snuck himself into the picture. It says Klaus O.W. Voormann, 66. Ultimately, the Beatles went with this design over Robert Freeman's because they played Klaus a little bit of the album, and when he came back with a design, they felt that that design accurately captured visually what they were trying to achieve musically, sonically, with the record. I think you can apply that same sort of logic to the title of the album. It's a pun, it's Revolver, it literally revolves, har har. But I think the title choice of this album was prescient, because the sound of this record blasts through the cultural zeitgeist like a gunshot. Other titles that were floated included Beatles on Safari, which I think sounds a little bit too much like earlier records like With the Beatles, Beatles for Sale, Beatles on Safari. Abracadabra, which I think could have been a good title, except that it was already taken by someone else. And Ringo's suggestion, After Geography, inspired by that Rolling Stones album, Aftermath. Get it? No, I'm pleased that they went with Revolver. I think Revolver is the perfect title to this album. Number 7. The Beatles were better musicians by the time this album came out than they had been previously. I can't speak specifically to John's performance as a musician because his job in the band as rhythm guitarist was to lay a foundation. So, by definition, that part is not meant to stick out. So that's John. Whatever. George had gone from being curious about the sitar and trying out different noises on it to becoming a dedicated student. By the time this album was released, he was studying under Ravi Shankar, the famous sitar player. He was practicing regularly. He was playing with a group of local musicians who played Indian music, and some of them played on Love You To. And between Norwegian Wood and Love You To, you can hear a tremendous improvement. And while I don't know specifically which sitar parts he was playing on Love You To, he is listed as a sitar player on that track. On top of that, the guitar parts on this record are far more intricate, and I would wager more interesting, than what they've done on previous albums. Like the riff on I Want to Tell You. I think that's a step up from Ticket to Ride. Even If I Needed Someone. I think it's well played, it's beautifully syncopated. And then you've got the harmonized guitar parts, which we mentioned earlier on tracks like And Your Bird Can Sing and Got to Get You Into My Life. Ringo, I think, is doing some of the best work of his career, basically from the beginning of this year until the end of 1967. It's bolder, it's sort of more curious, more exploratory. He's taking more risks as a musician, he's trying new things. You can hear that in the fills of Taxman. And obviously the drum part of Tomorrow Never Knows, which was sort of conceived in tandem with Paul McCartney and Paul's bass part. And speaking of Paul, he really begins to shine on this record, I think. We're getting to hear more of him playing piano, which of course he performs on Good Day Sunshine.
And when the sun is out.
And For No One. You see nothing, no sign of love behind her tears. He's also playing clavichord on For No One. You really get a glimpse of his guitar chops, because of course when Stewart left the band, he didn't want to be the bassist, but nobody else was going to do the job, so he took it up. It's really easy to forget that Paul McCartney is also a great guitarist. And with those harmonized guitar parts, Paul is the second guitarist. And of course, his bass work on this track is amazing. This is the album on which he really committed to the practice of coming into the studio after everyone had finished and just crafting bass lines, really composing them and building them up from something that is simply a foundational part of the song to an element that almost rivals lead guitar parts in its significance and its contribution to the tracks. You can hear it in these lovely fills on Here, There, and Everywhere. And then there's this one as well. It's very simple, but it adds a delightful little point of interest. Bass line on And Your Bird Can Sing. And my favorite, this part of Taxman. In case you missed that, let's have the bass correspondent break down exactly what it is that Paul McCartney is playing there. This is what is being played in the bridge of this song. Except he's playing it this fast. Number 6. That improved musicianship was able to be captured by better recording practices and technology. Day 1 of the recording sessions for Revolver was also Geoff Emerick's first day on the job as main engineer for the sessions. He was 20 years old and he had just been promoted from assistant engineer. And on that first day on the job, he basically invented a new way of recording drums. This technique involved basically shoving the microphone right up against the skin of the bass drum, which you were most certainly not allowed to do in EMI studios in 1966, in combination with a liberal use of compression at the studio end. It seemed to me, though, that if I moved all the drum mics in closer, say just a few inches away, we would hear a distinctly different tonal quality, one which I thought would suit the song. I knew I might get a bollocking from the studio manager for doing so, but my curiosity was piqued. The result of this was that you could have bigger, heavier bottom end on your recordings without the stylus flying out of the groove on the record. He also realized that because a speaker and a microphone are essentially the same creature, he could reverse wire one of the bass speakers, turn it into a microphone, press it up against another bass speaker, and capture that enormous bass sound more efficiently and more accurately than they had been able to do in the past. Again, applying a whole lot of compression at the studio end. And the end result is that you've got huge bass and huge drums blasting through the speakers at the listener's end. It transformed the way that rhythm sections were recorded in popular music because all of these other bands would listen to Revolver and go, make my album sound like this. And maybe that's part of the reason that Paul and Ringo sound so good on this album, that you can really hear what they're doing. The recording technology enables them to sound powerful. They did a similar thing with the horns on Got to Get You Into My Life. EMI Studios dictated that microphones had to be placed a certain distance away from instruments so that they weren't damaged. The microphones, not the instruments. And to that, George Martin, the producer, and Geoff Emerick, the engineer, said, "Pa!" And they took those microphones and they shoved them into the bells of the saxophones and the trumpets, and then again applied a whole lot of compression, which prevents the track from distorting because it compresses the really high bits and the really low bits. And that's how we get that really brash, almost abrasive brass sound on that track. That's why it sounds so fantastic. Ken Townsend, another engineer on the project, was inspired by John Lennon basically whinging about having to record his vocals twice in order to sort of thicken them out and give them texture on the recording, double tracking. And again, basically on the spot, created a technique in which he would take a delayed copy of the recorded audio and play it back at a slightly different speed in tandem with the original recording, so that it sounded like there were two distinct vocal tracks, but it only needed to be recorded once.
It's not an easy task to double track your own voice. The timing's got to be perfect. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I thought, there must be an easier way of doing this. It actually worked quite well. We played it and John Lennon was most impressed, actually. He fell in love with it straight away.
And that is still in use to this day. It's called automatic double tracking, or ADT. So that can be tracked, back to this album. And then, slightly tangentially to this, they brought in some top quality session musicians for some of the tracks on this record. For instance, on For No One, there's a French horn solo. That solo is played by Alan Seville, who was one of the best French horn players in London at the time. And Paul McCartney actually pushed this poor man to play a note that was outside of the usual range of the French horn. Alan was reluctant to even try it. He was actually breaking into a sweat, telling everyone it really shouldn't be done. But eventually he gave it a go and pulled it off. Though Alan was a wreck by the time he left that session, he was well pleased with what he'd done because it was the performance of his life. And that top note on the solo shouldn't be able to be played on a French horn. This man was so skilled that Paul asked him to do the impossible and he did it. Fantastic. Number 5. George Martin finally gets to shine as a producer. He had laid the groundwork in 1965. He convinced Paul to let him compose a part for a string quartet to accompany him on Yesterday.
Why she had to go.
It was a hard sell, but he did it. And later in the year, when they were recording In My Life for Rubber Soul, George Martin wrote and performed a piano solo, but he couldn't play it at the speed of the recording, so he played it slowly and sped it up, and that's what makes it sound kind of like a harpsichord. So he'd introduced the idea of classical orchestration and of using the studio as an instrument the year before. But this is the album where he really is enabled to come into his own here. The Beatles wanted more complicated sounds for this record, and so they were able to capitalize on George Martin's talents. Obviously, he played a big part in arranging the strings for Eleanor Rigby.
Wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave.
He also had experience with experimentation in classical music and musique concrète. I used to do a lot of experimenting with musique concrète. Speeding up tapes, making funny noises and plucking piano strings, that kind of thing. It was that experience that enabled him to work with the tape loops that the Beatles wanted to use on Tomorrow Never Knows. He also acted as a translator for the Beatles. For instance, on Got to Get You Into My Life, Paul McCartney had an idea of what he wanted the horns to sound like, but he had no written music, which was a bit of a shock to some of the players. So Paul sat at a piano and played the parts, and then George Martin was able to translate that to these session musicians so that they could turn that into the sounds that Paul McCartney wanted to hear.
He had a very great musical knowledge and background, so he could translate for us and suggest a lot of things. Well, we'd be saying, well, they go ooh and ee, and he'd say, well, look, chaps, I thought of this afternoon, and I came up with this, and we'd say, oh, great, I'll put it on here, I mean, he taught us a lot, and I'm sure we taught him a lot by our sort of primitive musical ability.
He was also an educator for the Beatles. He introduced them to studio concepts.
It's surprising what you can do once you have a sound recorded on tape. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can turn it round back to front, you can compress it, equalize it, add echo. There's a whole range of things you can do.
Concepts and technology that they had previously been unfamiliar with. They wouldn't have even known to do many of the things that they chose to do on this album if it hadn't been for George Martin introducing it to them. Number 4, George Harrison is afforded a lot more space on this record than he has in previous records. Prior to Revolver, George might get to sing or write 1 or 2 songs for an album, to John and Paul's 5 or 6 songs each. He was kind of a junior Beatle. On this album, he not only gets 3 song slots, he also gets the opening track, which is a place of distinction. Maybe it's because he'd proven his skill as a songwriter after contributing 2 of, I would say, the best songs on Rubber Soul. Either way, he was entrusted with more real estate on the vinyl. He also had significant input into the writing of She Said, She Said. He took 2 song fragments that John had been working on and helped him to stitch them together so that they became one whole song. And I've seen several sources that allege that George Harrison was the one who came up with the look at all the lonely people hook for Eleanor Rigby.
All the lonely people, where do they all come from?
So not only is he bringing more songs to the table, he's also helping the band's principal songwriters write their own songs. And the songs that he did bring radically shifted the Beatles' sound. Like Love You To, as I mentioned earlier, is nothing like anything the Beatles had done in the past. And that sound ends up infusing the entire album. Now, I think Rubber Soul is an album of stellar songs, But that dud of a closing track takes an otherwise perfect album and tarnishes it, taints it, even. By contrast, with this album, when John ran out of songs to contribute to the project, George was able to step up and supply them with the track that they were missing. Not only that, he had multiple songs up his sleeve. They were able to choose which of their favorites they wanted to put on the album. One of the rejected tracks was Isn't It a Pity, which later ended up on All Things Must Pass.
Isn't it a pity?
And the result, I think, is an album with no duds. And while there may be some of you in the comments who have strong feelings about Yellow Submarine, there isn't a single track on this album that I skip. Number 3. This album represents the perfect midway point of the Beatles. When you listen to this album, you can hear echoes of their rock and roll roots, which of course was a craft that they had been honing since Klaus Verman was first listening to them in the Kaiserkeller Club in Hamburg. But the experimentation and improved musicianship that you hear on this album points to the direction that the band will be moving in the future. If you listen closely to this album, you can catch glimpses of Sgt. Pepper's, of the White Album, of Abbey Road. Number 2, continuing on that theme, this album represents the end of an era. With this album, the Beatles dictate the image of the band. They're letting everyone know that they are no longer the charming mop tops riffing on American R&B with like a British twist. They're communicating that there's something greater, something more mature, something with a more bold and specific artistic direction, something that is more creatively driven. With Revolver, they control the narrative. They are telling the listeners and the media who they are, as opposed to the other way around, which is how it was, I think, earlier in their career. We've finally made it to number 1. My favorite element of this, the thing that for me supersedes all of the others, is that they are still friends. They still like each other when they're recording this album. And that love between these 4 men suffuses the album. It jumps out of every track when you're listening to it. You hear it in Paul's nods to George's newfound special interest that I mentioned in the Taxman solo, in his little vocal run at the end of I Want to Tell You. He's letting him know that he respects the validity of this thing that George is in love with at the moment. You can see it in the generosity with which George contributes to John's songs, like She Said, and Paul's songs, like Eleanor Rigby. They're helping each other. And further to that, you can see that in the blossoming connection that's forming between John and George after their shared experiences with LSD. She Said is basically a duet between the two of them. It's evident in John's explosive enthusiasm for Paul's vocal performance on Got to Get You Into My Life. At one point, while Paul was recording the lead vocal, John actually burst out of the control room to shout his encouragement, evidence of the camaraderie and teamwork that was so pervasive during the Revolver sessions. The recording of Yellow Submarine was essentially a giant party. They were all dressed in their finest Carnaby Street outfits, the women in mini skirts and flowing blouses, the men in purple bell-bottoms and fur jackets. And they were all totally sober. This motley crew raids the EMI store cupboard of anything that might make an interesting noise. Whistles, chains, bells, glasses, cash tills, hooters. And they set about making all of these fun sound effects for this track. It's so lovely to just imagine this scene in which everyone is just a little bit jolly, having a marvelous time together. The studio techs, the roadies, the friends, the band themselves. Or take Tomorrow Never Knows as an example. It was inspired by a book by Timothy Leary et al. Called The Psychedelic Experience. How did John get his hands on this book? Well, Paul McCartney was involved in the opening of this bookstore by a bunch of his new friends in the London artsy counterculture. And Paul invited John to hang out with him at this bookstore to share with him this project that he'd been working on outside of the Beatles. John discovers the book, John goes home, he writes a song, it becomes the most radical track on the album. And part of the reason it was such a revolutionary track was its use of electronically altered tape loops, an idea that Paul had brought to the band after mingling with that same crowd of the London counterculture. And he taught the rest of the band how to make their own tape loops. They all went off and did their little experimentations independently, brought them back, and then put them on the recording.
I had my own little setup to record them. As George says, we were drinking a lot of tea in those days, and on all my tapes you can hear, oh, I hope I've switched it on. I'd get so deranged from strong tea, I'd sit there for hours making those noises.
So everything that they're doing, they're sharing. It's not just that they're individuals exploring these new ideas, they are bringing them back to their friends. They're sharing these ideas with them, they're collaborating as a group. And they sound like they're having a marvelous time doing so. Certainly if the Andrew Bird Can Sing outtake is anything to go by.
You tell me that you've got the thing you want. You can't see me.
So there you go. I'm sure there are other reasons, many other reasons why this is such a great album. And if there's anything that you can think of that I've forgotten, I invite you to please put them in the comments. And I should probably mention that although I said that this is the roundup episode to the Revolver track by track series, I have been gently encouraged by no small number of you to also do the singles that accompanied this album. So over the next month, there will be 2 more Revolver Odyssey quasi-bonus episodes covering those 2 songs. And I look forward to seeing you there. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of the weird things I do, I'll leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you are most welcome to make a donation, but no pressure, friends. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I'll leave a link to that as well. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! Throughout this episode, I'm going to be including clips of, man, where's my brain today? In the tradition of Indian classical music. That song is followed by For No One, is it? Let's double check that before we say it with such confidence. Beyond Love You To, which is clearly drawing from the tradition of not English classical music, Indian classical music. Try again, please. And expect us to digest it straight. The album's kind of full of those little antacid tracks. That's a terrible metaphor. Let's try again. Another bass speaker, which was obviously doing speakery things. Okay, I'm gonna get the fly spray because this fly. After their shared experiences with LSD. Ooh, parrots. Pretty. I have been gently coerced. Who am I kidding? It's not coercion. Somebody suggested it and I went, that's a great idea. So I guess that technically that's not coercion at all.